All right, we can just go ahead and get started then. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Nate Crosser, Startup Growth Specialist at the Good Food Institute. Welcome to our webinar on the state of the industry of cultivated meat. By the end of today's session, we hope you'll have a good sense of the latest developments, the areas of opportunity, and trends in cultivated meat. Before we dive in, I'd like to go over a couple of administrative items. First, we will be sending a recording of the presentation and the slide deck to all registered attendees. Second, we are joined today by several GFI subject matter experts who will answer questions during the last 15 to 30 minutes of this 1 hour and 15-minute session. They are myself, my colleagues GFI Senior Scientist Elliot Swartz, Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs Elizabeth Derbies, Business Innovation Specialist Blake Byrne, and Research Analyst Kyle Gahn, who will also be our Q&A moderator. You will see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we will begin answering them at the end of the presentation. Simple ones may be answered directly in the chat as we go. Here's an overview of what we'll cover during today's approximately 45-minute presentation. First, I'll provide a brief introduction to the Good Food Institute. Then we'll look at why we focus on alternative proteins. Next, we'll dive into what cultivated meat is, the leading companies in the sector, the strategic and technical approaches they are taking, investments, scientific progress, and an update on the prospects for the market. For those not yet familiar with our organization, the Good Food Institute is a nonprofit 501c3 that is dedicated to accelerating the shift to a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. We are funded by philanthropy, not the industry, and earned GuideStar's 2019 Platinum Seal of Transparency, an honor obtained by less than 1% of nonprofits. Our organization employs over 90 staff around the globe with 3 key programmatic departments. In science and technology, our team of PhD scientists work to advance and open source the foundational science of alternative proteins. Our corporate engagement team builds relationships with the world's biggest food, meat, and life science companies, restaurants, and retailers, as well as entrepreneurs and investors to help them capitalize on opportunities in alternative proteins. Our policy team advocates for fair regulation of alternative proteins and lobbies for government investment in sustainable protein R&D. A key question we're working to address is, how will we feed 10 billion people by 2050? And how do we do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely? Looking at our current food system, the use of intensive animal agriculture presents a number of high-level risks. For example, according to the UN FAO, intensive farming produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire global transportation sector. It is the #1 user of freshwater on the planet. It is the #1 cause of Amazon deforestation. It is the #1 user of medically important antibiotics, and recent research suggests that if it goes unchecked, widespread antibiotic resistance could cost the global health industry up to $100 trillion by 2050. There are other global health impacts as well, particularly in the area of foodborne illness and zoonotic diseases, and this can have an enormous impact as we're seeing now. One good example of this is swine flu and its impact in China's pork production. There have been over 145 reported outbreaks in China since 2018, and over half of the breeding pig population has died or been culled. As the graph on the left shows, as the pig population decreases, the price of pork goes up considerably. As you can see, this industry is really ripe for transformation and significant impact these types of events can have on the food system. Perhaps the most fundamental problem with using animal bodies to produce meat is that they are inherently thermodynamically inefficient. Even in chickens, among the most efficient animals, about 90% of all calories they are fed are converted to feces, blood, bones, organs, heat, and fuel for the animal's day-to-day metabolism. No matter how much further we genetically manipulate animals, animal respiration is inefficient, and we will not be able to sustainably nourish a growing population with this ancient technology. Despite all of this, demand for meat continues to grow and shows no sign of slowing, driven not only by a growing population, but also by rising incomes in many parts of the world. For example, as you can see here, demand for poultry is expected to increase by 120% by 2050. We can tell people to eat more plates of grains, beans, and greens, but this has been tried many times with little success. People love meat. So to borrow a phrase from Y Combinator, let's make something people want. Let's make meat but in a better way. And we believe the way to do this is with alternative proteins, which we see fitting into these three categories. We can make proteins directly from plants with fermentation technology or using animal cell culture. In this presentation, we will be focusing on animal cell culture, a type of cellular agriculture for the cultivation of meat. The concept of cultivated meat, also called cultured, cell-based, or clean meat, is decades old. In fact, in 1931, Winston Churchill predicted, quote, "We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium," end quote. There have been a handful of research projects on cultivated meat since then, including Mark Post's historic hamburger patty demonstration in 2013. But it was not until 2015 that cultivated meat as an industry was born, with the first company formations. Since then, industry growth has been close to exponential. In order to track the developments in the cultivated meat industry, as well as the plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy industries, GFI created its flagship State of the Industry reports, which dive into the competitive landscape, technological advancements, investment trends, predictions for the future, and other essential information for understanding the fundamental transformation occurring in the way that we make meat that people love. This presentation illustrates some of the highlights from the second annual GFI State of the Industry report on cultivated meat. In case this is new to you, I'll briefly introduce the concept of meat cultivation, which has its roots in biomedical tissue engineering, think growing organ replacements, and microbial fermentation, think producing human insulin in yeast cells. Cultivating meat is a form of cellular agriculture where we, to oversimplify, take animal cells, bathe them in a soup of nutrients as they grow in number, then harvest the meat. Cultivated meat can provide the same sensory and nutritional experience as conventional animal meat because it is comprised of the same cells. It is not imitation or synthetic meat, it is actual animal meat grown outside of an animal. At scale, it is produced in cultivators in much the same way beer is brewed or plants are grown from a cutting. My colleague Elliot Swartz will go into more depth on the production process, and you can learn more at GFI's Clean Meat Production 101 primer, available at gfi.org. By cultivating only the desired meat directly from cells, you can produce meat with fewer resources and significantly less environmental impact. For instance, compared with conventional beef, cultivated beef is estimated to reduce land use by more than 95%, climate change emissions by 74 to 87%, and nutrient pollution by 94%. Since cultivated meat is grown in a clean facility without the need for slaughter, it also effectively eliminates the risk of contamination by harmful pathogens such as Salmonella and E. coli. One of cultivated meat's most important advantages is that it does not require therapeutic antibiotics, thereby reducing the serious and growing public health threat posed by antibiotic resistance. Similar technology can be used to create cultivated leather, collagen, ivory, and other animal products, but we focus on the primary product of animal agriculture, meat. Meat is one of the world's largest industries. A robust ecosystem of cultivated meat companies is forming to fundamentally transform the way animal meat is produced. Top investors, such as Y Combinator, view cultivated meat as one of the great opportunities of the fourth industrial revolution, alongside AI, robotics, and synthetic biology. Since the first cultivated meat companies formed in 2015, the competitive landscape has grown with increasing speed, nearly doubling a number of established startups every year. This graphic provides a non-exhaustive sampling of companies in this space. By the end of 2019, 55 total cultivated meat and seafood industry startups had publicly announced themselves. Now, there are over 57 companies that appear to be primarily focused on cultivated meat production. Many more companies are pursuing cultivated meat as an additional business area. More than 1/3, 20 total, of all cultivated meat companies were founded or left stealth mode in 2019 alone. In 2019, cultivated meat companies launched in 12 countries across 5 continents. In early 2020, Africa's first cultivated meat company, Mzansi Meat, launched, meaning that there are cultivated meat companies on all continents except Antarctica. There are now cultivated meat companies in 20 countries, spurred by robust innovation ecosystems, government investments, university research, investor interest, and favorable consumer sentiment. Although more than 1/3 of these companies are based in the United States, large concentrations also exist in Europe, Canada, Israel, and the Asia-Pacific region. In 2019 and 2020, 2/3 of all newly formed companies were outside the United States, and the first cultivated meat companies in Russia, Switzerland, Argentina, France, Chile, and South Africa were formed. In China, the number of cultivated meat companies tripled in 2019 from 1 to 3. Cuisines and dietary choices vary greatly by geography, and this diversity across regions offers new market opportunities for the cultivated meat industry. For example, fish maw, the swim bladder of large fish, is a Chinese delicacy. In March 2019, Hong Kong-based Avant Meats held the world's first taste test of cultivated fish maw as part of their larger plan to tackle the seafood category. In August 2019, Australia-backed Vow Foods offered the world's first tasting of cultivated kangaroo. In France, Japan, and Belgium, startups Gourmet, Integriculture, and Piece of Meat aim to produce cultivated foie gras by culturing duck liver cells. In Russia, Art Meat formed in 2019 to create cultivated horse and sturgeon, which are commonly eaten there. Cultivated meat isn't just a product to feed the world. It could be the way we feed a spacefaring civilization on Mars or beyond. Last year, Aleph Farms proved that meat can even be cultivated in space by culturing bovine cells in the International Space Station. Cultivated meat varieties in production are in no way limited to culturally niche products, however. Most companies are focused on cultivating meats that are consumed in massive amounts across the globe. Companies are now pursuing over 17 types of cultivated meat, including beef, chicken, pork, shrimp, lobster, crab, duck, whitefish, mouse, salmon, tuna, bison, and lamb, plus those previously mentioned. These meat types are desirable for both their technical characteristics, for example, factors in difficulty or ease of cultivation, and their appeal to the companies' target markets. The majority of startups formed to date have set out to develop vertically integrated meat production platforms, which we have categorized as business to consumer, or B2C. There are now 34 companies pursuing cultivated meat with a B2C strategy, and 8 companies pursuing this vertically integrated strategy with cultivated seafood. The first cultivated meat and seafood companies to form predominantly took a B2C approach. However, as the industry matures, it has become apparent that perhaps even greater opportunities live upstream in the value chain. Equally abundant are opportunities downstream for production in food science, business services, safety, distribution, marketing, and food preparation. To draw an analogy to the gold rush, the most reliable way to profit was not prospecting for gold, but rather being the one selling the picks and shovels. In a future where a substantial portion of our meat supply is grown at the cellular level, the largest profit opportunities are likely not at retail, but along the supply chain. This huge opportunity for horizontal entry points by business-to-business startups is evidenced by the growing number of upstream suppliers. Of the 20 companies that launched in 2019, 13 were cultivated meat or seafood producers, but 7 were business-to-business, B2B startups, focused primarily on serving cultivated meat and seafood producers. There are now at least 15 companies serving the cultivated meat and seafood industry as the core of their business, with many more companies collaterally involved. It is worth noting that several companies are pursuing both B2B and B2C strategies simultaneously, and the lines are not always clear. My colleague, Elliot Swartz, senior scientist at GFI, will talk more about the main areas for business-to-business opportunities in cultivated meat, as well as the underlying technology.
All right. Thank you, Nate. So I'd like to start with an introduction to how we segment our thinking based on the different technology categories in cultivated meat, which I like to think of as 4 independent pieces to the larger puzzle of commercializing cultivated meat. Each of these 4 technology categories, the cell line development, cell culture media, bioprocessing, and scaffolding, will require heavy amounts of R&D, innovation, and interdisciplinary teams of scientists to solve. And we can't really succeed in lowering costs and scaling up cultivated meat without success in each of these categories. Now, we can think about each of these categories as making up an independent component of the technology-specific value chain. And as Nate mentioned, many B2C companies are vertically integrated and likely working on each of these categories simultaneously. But this can be somewhat challenging because each of these areas is capital and resource intensive and requires different skill sets to achieve. So in 2019, we started to track a trend of new companies forming that aim to integrate horizontally into this value chain, as well as companies in external areas of the life sciences that aim to translate their technology platforms to service the cultivated meat industry. And it's likely that the uniqueness of cultivated meat as an endeavor will require a lot of technology co-development in tandem with the B2C companies or other academic labs active in the sector. So I want to dive into each of these four categories separately. So the cell line development involves the selection of the species and the cell type that you choose as the starting material for your bioprocess. Now, there are obviously multiple species that you can select, but there are also multiple different stem cell types that can be chosen. And this choice will ultimately dictate a lot of the downstream considerations. So for instance, what the medium formulation is, the characteristics of the scaffolding, the processing timelines, and even the end product. And a huge bottleneck in the industry is simply having access to quality cell lines made from different stem cell types and different species used in cultivated meat. So 2019 saw the birth of the first company that has a focus on B2B cell lines, a company called Cell Farm Food Tech based in Argentina that aims to produce cell lines from unique Argentinian breeds of cattle that may perhaps have desirable end product traits. Earlier this year, GFI signed an agreement with the life science reagent provider Carafast to house a repository of cell lines created in industry or academia, such that researchers can use these lines off the shelf for R&D or even strike up a commercial licensing agreement. We've also funded other projects that aim to produce cell lines from terrestrial species and salmon, but additional similar efforts are needed to cover the range of species and cell types used in cultivated meat. And lastly, it's important to mention that the cell line engineering presents a large IP opportunity for companies, and a lot of the patent literature filed to date involves certain engineering of cell lines. Now, ultimately, the extent of engineering will be influenced by regulatory guidances, but there's a large opportunity to improve cultivated meat processes through cell line engineering or other forms of optimization. The cell culture media is made up of a variety of proteins, amino acids, sugars, lipids, vitamins, and other micronutrients that enable cells to essentially grow and divide. And we know that the cell culture is currently the major cost driver for the industry, and thus there's a pressing need to develop more affordable inputs and optimized formulations. So the first step in media optimization will usually involve overcoming a reliance on animal serum that's commonly used as a supplement to culture animal cells. And this past year, at least 6 B2C companies have declared themselves serum-free as an announcement or otherwise noted in the press. But this has likely required a lot of in-house resources, and in general, serum-free media are still expensive to produce. So new companies have sprung up to provide assistance by either creating novel formulations or high-value ingredients, such as growth factors and other recombinant proteins that are the known major cost driver within the media itself. Some companies focus on finding plant-based alternatives like BIFTech noted on this slide, while others may focus on growth factor engineering or modes of production that make them more affordable. To this point, last year, a publication from a group out of Northwestern University demonstrated that the commercial costs of a popular stem cell media could be reduced by 97% just by focusing on growth factor engineering and producing them at small scales in their own lab. And this provides a really good proof of concept of the large cost gaps that can be closed rather quickly with existing technologies. So from here, the other raw material inputs like the amino acids, the sugars, et cetera, become a major cost driver, and sourcing these ingredients from plants or other microorganisms at food or even feed grade standards should be able to lower those costs further. And lastly, there remain opportunities to develop medium recycling technologies and ways to create value from waste products in the media, such as cellular secreted proteins or ammonia and lactic acid. And we expect additional companies to sort of explore this as a potential opportunity in the future. Scaffolding is the term that describes the structures that cells need to attach to. And the scaffolds can come in the form of microcarriers to aid cell proliferation and scale up, or as a prefabricated structure that can be used to structure and to create structured end products. So I like to think of scaffolding sort of as a technology segment that's separated by the methods of assembly and the materials used for assembly. And there are a variety of different methods that come from other industries being tried for cultivated meat, such as 3D printing being used by companies like Vivax Bio, Meat Tech, and Nova Meat, or electrospinning or other polymer spinning technologies like those used by biomimetic solutions, or even leveraging nature and making scaffolds through decellularized plants or fungal mycelium, like the approach that Atlast is using. So it's likely that all of these methods will play some role in the future of cultivated meat products. And the materials selected by the industry can also influence the choice of the assembly method and even the downstream end product. Now, ultimately, the industry will need to use edible, food safe, and or biodegradable materials that are abundant and affordable. For instance, those might be cellulose from plants or alginate from algae. And so I expect a lot more R&D activity and new companies to be founded in the scaffolding technology segment in the coming years that really explore combinations of these methods and materials. The bioprocess strategy is what pieces all of the other technology areas together to form the end-to-end process of creating cultivated meat. And a principal component of the bioprocess strategy is the mode of production determined by the selection of the bioreactor itself. So many companies in the sector use bioreactor types that have been developed by other industries and may work well for some components of their process, but may need to be fit for purpose in other ways that are unique, such as the harvesting or cell differentiation and maturation that's needed for the cultivated meat process. So companies involved in the horizontal value chain integration and bioprocessing have focused on improving current bioreactor designs. For instance, a company like Cell Motions creates a novel impeller system that aids in the mixing of stirred tank bioreactor formats, or working on different modes of production altogether, similar to what's being pursued by Cellular Agriculture Ltd. And Cellular Revolution. So solutions for bioprocessing come in the form of both hardware and software. So for instance, Biocellion and in silico biotechnology aim to leverage computational software that can inform, predict, or improve key process parameters. And there's also a need for the creation of sensor systems that integrate into the bioreactors to inform the development of new software. So, and lastly, some of the patent filings in the cultivated meat industry to date have focused on different bioprocessing strategies. So for instance, Integriculture uses a platform called Culnet that uses a series of interconnected bioreactors housing different cell types to provide the nutrients and proteins that feed the cells used to create their end products. Now, some of the companies on the previous slides were established prior to the cultivated meat industry and are simply using their technologies for a new purpose. But many of the companies have started alongside the industry with the plan to grow alongside of it. And there's also a big opportunity for other large companies to fuel innovation and provide partnership or technology solutions for the industry. And we began to see this take more shape in 2019. So for example, the large life sciences company Merck launched a grant program in bioreactor design. They incubated 2 new cultivated meat startups. They invested in Moza Meat through their venture arm and began to build out internal teams to create product solutions for the industry. DSM, another large industrial biotech company, launched an incubator space with a shared pilot production facility that currently houses the cultivated meat company Meatable. Some of the largest global meat manufacturers, including Tyson, PHW Group, and Cargill, have invested in cultivated meat startups and can provide expertise on end product design, go-to-market strategy, and distribution. We've also seen partnerships with animal feed provider Nutraco that can lower the friction in raw material supply chains used for the cell culture media. So I think we expect more and similar partnerships to occur as companies move to Series A and beyond in the future. So I'll turn it back to Nate now to overview the investment landscape.
Thanks, Elliot. GFI conducted a custom global analysis of cultivated meat companies using PitchBook data. We built a list in PitchBook of 43 companies whose core business is cultivated meat, either B2C or B2B. It excludes many companies that are involved in meat cultivation, but not as their core business, such as Just, Wild Earth, and Biomimetic Solutions. Because these aggregate calculations include only companies with deals and deal sizes disclosed to PitchBook, they are conservative estimates. To access full investment data, please contact PitchBook. From February 2016, when Memphis Meats closed their $2.75 million seed round, through the end of 2019, cultivated meat companies received more than $166 million in disclosed venture capital investment. Nearly half of this investment, more than $77 million, was closed in 2019 alone. In 2019, the industry continued to mature quickly, with 5 additional Series A fundraising rounds, more than the 4 total in the industry's previous history. For cultivated seafood fundraising in particular, 2019 was a watershed year. 3 cultivated seafood companies raised Series A rounds. Wild Type raised $12.5 million, Blue Nalu raised a record-setting $20 million, and Finless Foods raised an undisclosed amount. In April, just 1 year after their founding, Shack Meats secured a $4.6 million seed round to develop cultivated shrimp in Singapore. Although 2019 was in many ways historic, Memphis Meats Series B in early 2020 shattered the records. Initially announced at $161 million, Memphis Meats, which was the first company to demonstrate cultivated chicken and duck, ended up raising a $186.25 million oversubscribed Series B fundraising round. This infusion of cash was greater than all of the publicly disclosed investment into the cultivated meat industry previously. This round was led by SoftBank, Temasek, and Norwest Venture Partners. Funders of Memphis Meats also include angels Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Jack Welch, and Kimball Musk, venture capital funds SOSV, Threshold Ventures, Finisterre, Future Ventures, 50 Years, KBW Ventures, Vulcan Capital, and CPT Capital, and meat companies Tyson and Cargill. Memphis Meats expects to use the funds to build a pilot production facility, continue to grow its team, and to hit a major milestone of launching products into the market. This round is not only a strong validated moment for Memphis Meats, but for the entire cultivated meat industry, and we expect investment to accelerate. Since the Memphis Meats Series B closed in early 2020, several other fundraising rounds have followed. Japanese startup Integriculture raised a $7.5 million Series A led by Nippon Meat Packers, VU Venture Partners, and Realtek Fund for their newly launched UniColdNet cell culture system and to further develop their cultivated poultry. Spanish startup Cubic Foods raised $5 million from Blue Horizon Ventures to accelerate production of their cultivated chicken fat. Finally, Israeli cultivated meat 3D printing company MeatTech, which became publicly traded on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange in 2019, raised $5.7 million in 2020. Now, more than half of cultivated meat companies, at least 32 in total, have raised external VC funding. The top 10 most well-capitalized companies in cultivated meat and seafood are currently Memphis Meats, Blue Nalu, Future Meat Technologies, Wild Type, MeatTech, Ayla Farms, Meatable, Integriculture, Mosa Meat, and Mission Barns. Since the pioneering venture investors in the sector, including New Crop Capital, SOSV, Stray Dog Capital, and 50 Years, began writing checks in 2016, total funding to cultivated meat companies has roughly doubled every year. Despite total VC investment in the space increasing over 3,800% in the past 5 years, investment in cultivated meat still pales in comparison to other sectors, like the $10.9 billion in venture capital for augmented reality startups or $5.7 billion for cannabis companies during that period. This gulf between cultivated meat investment and other industries is primarily a factor of nascency. Although it is still the early days of the field, there is tremendous momentum. This fundraising momentum is not exclusive to cultivated meat companies. We see it across other alternative proteins like plant-based food. In Q1 2020, US-based or selling plant-based food companies raised over $740 million from VC, a 62% increase from 2019 in that quarter alone. There is now more investor interest than ever for making meat without animals. By the end of 2019, there were 125 unique investors in cultivated meat companies. As of June 2020, there are now 152 investors. Venture capital funds make up the majority of investors by number and includes a diverse mix of biotechnology, deep tech, specialty alternative protein, impact, and industry agnostic investors. Although the field of investors is currently small compared to the 5,800 investors in ag tech and 3,500 in food tech, it boasts some of the world's brightest minds, largest companies, best investors, and governments. Investors like Sergey Brin, Cargill, Y Combinator, SoftBank, and the European Commission will act as a beacon as the industry becomes more mainstream. The most active investors by deal count in cultivated meat are SOSV, New Crop Capital, Stray Dog Capital, CPT Capital, Beyond Investing, Strauss Group, Agronomics, Blue Horizon, Social Starts, and Starlight Ventures. In 2019, several top venture capital investors in the alternative protein space created or raised new funds that will be available to fuel the formation and growth of new companies in the cultivated meat sector. These include SOSV's $277 million fourth fund, Big Idea Ventures' $50 million new protein fund, and Egg Funder's $20 million new carnivore fund. In December 2019, Agronomics raised close to $9 million targeted for investment in cultivated meat companies before raising another $6.9 million a month later. These specialized investment funds, as well as growing mainstream investor interest, mean startups will have plenty of capital to secure in the years to come, even if broader venture capital markets slow down. I'll now pass it back to Elliot to discuss scientific milestones in cultivated meat.
Thanks, Nate. So I wanted to touch on this idea of the emergence of a broader R&D ecosystem and the new entrants to that ecosystem. Now, as mentioned before, there's a lot of R&D opportunity across diverse technology areas that ultimately is going to be best served by a solid foundation of early stage research in academia that can be easily translated to commercial opportunities. So we'll need a continued influx of interdisciplinary scientists and new public funding sources to fuel the science moving forward. To touch on academic research, we observed many new peer-reviewed publications in 2019 with more focus on specific aspects of technology such as scaffolding that's highlighted here. So this indicates that more hands-on research is starting to be performed rather than just drafting review articles, which has kind of dominated the literature previously. While some of this research has been independently funded or come from startup founders that also run academic labs, as shown here, Mark Post and Shulamit Levenberg's labs have published papers in the literature, but also run cultivated meat companies. The research has largely been fueled by nonprofits to date. And for the past 2 years, GFI has run a competitive research grants program that has funded $3.25 million to date for cultivated meat projects in 8 different countries. We saw a 92% increase year over year for applications, indicating this increased interest by academic and industry groups. And other support for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows in the field has been provided by New Harvest. In order to keep track of all these happenings, GFI has launched several databases for the public to increase visibility of ongoing projects or funding opportunities for researchers. We've recently launched an academic lab database that tracks ongoing cultivated meat research projects in tandem with a student guide that can assist in helping students learn what subjects to study and what projects may exist for them to start research on. Our GF Ideas community expanded to include both entrepreneurs and scientists. And in response, we've welcomed over 550 scientists from 38 different countries in just the past 2 months alone. Our research funding database tracks global funding opportunities currently available to cultivated meat and other alternative protein researchers. We've noticed that in general, the amount of interested researchers far outweighs the amount of opportunities available. And so we need more participation from governments to fuel R&D. And a great example comes from Singapore's A-Star, who announced funding opportunities for high-impact research in cultivated meat at the end of last year, with award announcements to be made in the coming months of this year. And then lastly, incubators and accelerators have continued to support new company formation in cultivated meat. And some of the most well-renowned biotech incubators have provided funding and mentorship to companies across the sector. IndieBio in particular stands out by their participation in 10 funding rounds for cultivated meat companies to date, with other life sciences and food tech focused accelerators also making contributions. And our map of incubators and accelerators allows founders to easily find potential funding routes to start their new businesses. We're also encouraging and tracking the formation of public-private consortia or research centers of excellence housed at different academic institutions. So last year, the Cultivated Meat Modeling Consortium launched with several industry partners with the aim of using computational models to reduce the cost and time in solving technical challenges for cultivated meat. The consortium was awarded a GFI research grant and also received funding from Merck KGaA to build a proof of concept model of cells in bioreactors, with results of that model to be announced publicly in the coming months. And I sit on the working group for that consortium, and I'm really been super impressed and excited with all that's been accomplished in just a few months. And this will ultimately unlock the doors for computer scientists to contribute more to cultivated meat development. Last year, the team at GFI India helped facilitate and launch the first ever research center of excellence based in Mumbai that's first focused on mutton production. So we're particularly keen on replicating these efforts at other universities and are working to gather interested faculty to apply for grants that can lead to the establishment of similar research centers. So lastly, the expanding science and understanding of growing animal cells at large scales ultimately unlocks the ability to create a more diverse set of animal food products. So people on the call may be familiar with broader cellular agriculture efforts to produce leather from animal cells or dairy proteins from fermentation, such as what Perfect Day is doing. But 2019 saw a new application develop of cultivated milk. So similar bioprocesses can ultimately be used to produce milk components such as whey and casein proteins, lipids, and lactose by growing cells of the mammary tissue that are involved in milk production and secretion. And both Turtle Tree Labs based in Singapore and BioMilk based in North Carolina are applying this technology to produce human and or animal breast milk for infant formula or dairy food products. So I'll turn it back over to Nate to close out.
Thanks, Elliot. Lastly, we will zoom out a bit and look at the prospects for the cultivated meat industry. Although there is a tremendous amount of momentum behind the industry, it is still less than 10 years old and has a ways to go in terms of scale up, which will require significant financing, capacity building, regulatory approvals, and technical optimization. However, GFI analysis shows that cultivated meat is feasible and will reach the market without the need for any new moonshot scientific breakthroughs. As with any industrial biotechnology, cultivated meat must progress from bench scale to pilot scale to commercial scale production. Currently, several companies are building their pilot scale facilities. It may take 1 to 2 or more years for them to establish pilot scale proof of concept, which will allow for limited product launches in certain jurisdictions, likely through food service channels. Afterwards, they can build their full production facilities that will deliver products broadly to the market. This graphic provides a condensed industry timeline with some of GFI's conservative predictions for the future. We project it is likely that, in the next decade, commercial scale meat production will be a reality. Consulting firm McKinsey shares this view, predicting that by 2030, cultivated meat will be cost competitive with conventional animal production systems and is well positioned to succeed in the future. Many factors could speed up this timeline. The build-out of an ecosystem of business-to-business cultivated meat companies, the increasing involvement of life science companies, government regulatory and financial support, and increased capital inflows following successful pilot scale proof of concepts may serve to accelerate commercialization of these products. In addition to standalone cultivated meat products, we expect that companies will create blended products using both plant-based and animal cell-based ingredients, which could further reduce time to market. For example, cultivated fat cells can be mixed with plant-based proteins to deliver new, flavorful, healthy products. Some companies, like Cubic Foods, have focused on producing cultivated fat for this purpose. Meat cultivation technology will allow companies to produce products that surpass existing meat paradigms in terms of functionality, taste, nutrition, and experience. Governments will play an important role in the success of cultivated meat industries within their borders. Thus far, governments have been largely neutral, but several have emerged as supporters of the industry because it serves important goals like food security, food sovereignty, biosecurity, and bioeconomy growth. In Singapore, for example, a country that imports 94% of its food, the government launched a 120-person Food Innovation Institute to promote novel production methods such as meat cultivation. In 2019, more governments recognized that cultivated meat is the future of sustainable, scalable meat production. The EU's European Commission, for example, granted Dutch meat startup Meatable $3 million to help bring cultivated pork to market. Belgium's Ministry of Innovation created a consortium of companies working on cultivated foie gras with a €3.6 million grant. This program, called Foiture, is a collaboration among Piece of Meat, a cultivated meat startup, a research university, a pâté producer, Biobase Europe pilot plant, an ingredient supplier, and Flanders Food, an agri-food innovation center. Foiture is a paradigm for diverse, dynamic groups effectively coming together to transform the food system. As Elliot mentioned, the government of India has also dedicated funds to research in cellular agriculture, hoping to establish India as a hub for the future of protein production. In addition to technological progress, we have seen significant advancement on the regulatory front. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a formal agreement providing cultivated meat with a much clearer path to market in the United States. Essentially, the FDA will oversee the earlier stages of meat production, cultivated meat production, and the USDA will oversee the later stages. Specifically, the FDA will oversee cell collection, cell banks, and cell proliferation and differentiation, including aspects of inspections of cell banks and culturing facilities to ensure compliance with FDA regulations. The USDA will inspect harvesting and post-harvesting facilities, approve cultivated meat labels, and verify the applicability of these labels through inspections. The FDA and USDA have since formed 3 interagency working groups focused on pre-market review, harvest and inspection, and labeling of cultivated meat. In May 2020, the U.S. Government Accountability Office released a report on recommendations for the regulation of cultivated meat. These developments strongly signal that the agencies will work together to ensure that cultivated meat products are safe and accurately labeled when they hit the market. With formal guidelines to follow, we are optimistic that both agencies are committed to creating a fair regulatory framework for cultivated meat production and sale in the U.S. Not surprisingly, since this is a global industry, some companies are also pursuing regulatory approval in other countries. GFI is working to facilitate regulatory approval around the world, including in Israel, India, Brazil, Asia Pacific, and Europe. Regulators in Singapore have shown particular interest in cultivated meat and seafood, devoting millions to promoting the local industry and installing a progressive regulatory framework, and so the country may be the first outside the United States to approve cultivated meat product. Similarly, Hong Kong is expected to institute a smooth regulatory process to reduce time to market. One regulatory risk is label censorship. Since Missouri's 2018 enactment of a law prohibiting the use of meat terminology on cultivated and plant-based meat labels, legislators in a range of states introduced similar bills that would unconstitutionally censor cultivated meat labels. Most, but not all, of the bills introduced in 2019 failed. The enacted laws are subject to constitutional challenges on multiple grounds, including federal preemption of state laws and commercial free speech. Once cultivated meat products are available commercially, there is strong evidence that they will be met enthusiastically by consumers across the world's largest markets. In 2019, consumer researchers published results from several groundbreaking focus group and survey studies that indicate that enthusiastic innovator and early adopter segments will readily purchase cultivated meat once it hits the market. About 1 in 3 U.S. consumers say they are likely to regularly purchase cultivated meat, and about 1 in 5 respond they are willing to pay a higher price for cultivated meat than for its conventional counterpart. Dutch consumers indicate they are willing to pay nearly 40% more. A survey for Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems found that 59% of Chinese consumers and 56% of Indian consumers were very or extremely likely to regularly purchase cultivated meat. Although many cultivated meat companies may first go to market in the United States, Singapore, Israel, or the EU, ultimately India and China will be monumental opportunities for cultivated meat producers to sell to populations growing rapidly in size, wealth, and per capita meat consumption. As cultivated meat becomes more accessible and normalized in societies, we expect adoption by the majority of populations to build over time, as has been the case with innovations throughout history. The early and late majority groups, composing about 68% of any population, already express interest in cultivated meat, but desire more information about taste, price, and safety. Once cultivated meat is on the market, the taste will be apparent and regulatory approval will cue safety. As supply increases and price reaches an acceptable threshold, for example, price parity in grocery stores, these majority groups will also be likely to purchase cultivated meat. Familiarity with meat cultivation and cultural normalization will also drive these later segments to adopt. Evidence indicates that after learning about the meat cultivation process, mainstream consumers have high purchase intent and even a willingness to pay more. In 2019, GFI teamed up with food innovation consultancy Matson to determine the nomenclature that would maximize descriptiveness and appeal for these products. We conducted surveys and focus groups to examine over 400 neutral terms, including cell-based, cultured, cell-cultured, nanopastured, and propagated. Ultimately, cultivated meat and the narrative of cultivation and a cultivator scored highest across appeal and descriptiveness. This is the terminology GFI and many leaders in the space have adopted. Because the cultivated meat industry is in its nascency, investors, entrepreneurs, scientists, and corporations have vast opportunities to get involved in the early stages and capitalize on this global shift in meat production. While we believe it is still too early to make firm market projections, the enormous overall scale of opportunity is undeniable. Meat companies Cargill, Tyson, and JBS alone brought in more than $200 billion in global revenue in 2019, and the meat market is expected to grow significantly, with global demand for meat projected to rise by more than 50% by 2050. However, the current meat production system is inefficient and vulnerable, relying on razor-thin margins, and is susceptible to disruption by disease of workers and animals alike. We are seeing this with COVID-19 ravaging meat processing facilities in the US, swine fever devastating hog populations in China, and the multitude of avian flu outbreaks across the world. Capturing even a fraction of meat demand is a massive opportunity. If cultivated meat captured only 10% of the approximately $1.7 trillion global meat market, that would be $170 billion in annual revenue. Because such companies have collectively still raised less than $500 million in funding, we believe substantial room for new investment still exists. Equally as vital, there are opportunities all along the value chain for food companies, life science companies, business service providers, researchers, entrepreneurs, and others to be a part of the future of real, sustainable meat and seafood production and distribution. This concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. To learn more about the Good Food Institute, please visit gfi.org, and to download our State of the Industry reports, please visit gfi.org/industry. We will now take the remainder of our 1 hour and 15-minute session for questions, which will be moderated by my colleague Kyle Gahn. We are joined by various GFI experts to answer questions if applicable. Please submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A feature. Turning it over to you, Kyle.
Hi, Nate. Thank you very much. For the first question, I'd like to direct it to Elliot. It's one of the earlier questions we received. Specifically, with regards to livestock's inefficient conversion of calories, what about livestock's utility in converting inedible calories into food for humans? So I think it's a question of
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so we actually don't have good publicly available data on that yet. We'd love to see more data on that released to get better estimations. I think some estimations that have been thrown out is in the ballpark of 3 calories to 1 out. And according to a report last year by A.T. Kearney, they estimated that it would take about 1.5 kilos of raw plant materials to produce 1 kilo of meat. So there's different ways to look at really the feed conversion of raw material inputs like amino acids and sugars that ultimately make up the biomass and the caloric content of the cultivated meat product. But right now there's no solid numbers around the conversion of efficiency ratios.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Elliot. What are the waste products of cell-based meats, and what percentage of them can be recycled?
It's a good question. I guess the primary metabolites that generally are considered of interest would be ammonia and lactic acid, and these are of interest because they are toxic over time in dense cultures. They can actually become toxic at higher concentrations to cells, and so they need to be removed from the media. But it could be an option that you would want to capture these components and then create value of them by inserting them into other industries, either creating something like fertilizer from the ammonia or polylactic acid from the lactic acid that's released by the cells. I'm unsure of the certain ratios that are secreted of different metabolites, yeah, there's a bunch of others that are obviously released as well, but those are kind of the 2 main metabolites of interest.
Great, thank you. And now a question to Elizabeth. There's a question on labeling, as well as just general regulatory and food safety compliance. If you could answer those.
Thanks. Yeah, there was a question, I think, from Jason about the regulatory status of these products, and I'm not sure whether, Jason, you're asking about a particular jurisdiction. In the U.S., The FDA and USDA have said that they will jointly regulate these products, and they have a formal agreement that is public in which they sort of divide up jurisdiction for beef, pork, and poultry products. FDA will be the sole regulator for seafood. They've not put out specifics as to, exactly how companies will have to demonstrate the safety of their product. They have 3 working groups looking at the issue of safety approvals and also labeling. And I'm forgetting the 3rd working group. In other countries, it really just depends where you are. I mean, many countries have a novel food regulatory framework where you go to a particular regulatory authority and sort of show them a package of safety information to demonstrate safety, and they approve your food or add it to a novel foods list. Places that have novel food frameworks include the EU, Australia, and New Zealand. I believe China has something like a novel food framework, although it's not called that exactly. But no cultivated meat products have been approved by regulators yet. And to the labeling question, it's going to be specific to those same regulators. And again, we've in general not seen specific guidance yet on labeling and what will need to be on the label or be permitted to be on the label, with the exception of some legislative attempts in various of the US states that in some cases seek to prevent cultivated meat companies from using meat terminology on their labels. But there are constitutional problems, we think, with a lot of that legislation. And that is being challenged in several states.
Great, thank you. Question for Elliot. Has there been success in cultivated meat production using serum-free formulation and individual additions of growth factors, vitamins, and other components?
Sure. So, in general, in stem cell biology, there's been various serum-free mediums that have been formulated over time that are commonly used in human and mouse cell culture, for instance. And so, we had a fairly good understanding of what to do to create serum-free medium formulations. As I mentioned on my slides, I've been tracking at least 6 companies in the sector that have stated in the press or have publicly announced otherwise that they are using entirely serum-free formulations for the production process. And pretty much every company has stated that they would never sell a product with serum to be used. So I think the answer is yes. And there's obviously, I think, more work to be done to probably optimize these formulations to have them perform better over time. But companies are already, sort of getting past that hurdle of becoming serum free and optimizing their formulas.
Question for Nate. Are there too many cultivated meat companies? Is there enough investment money to go around?
To the first question, there are certainly not too many cultivated meat companies. Meat is an absolutely monumental global industry that's one of the largest in the world, and we have right now about 50 companies that are working to transform that, and that we're very bullish on the technological ability to do that. But there's huge opportunities for more entrants to produce a wider variety of meat products, and also to get aligned all on the value chain. I mean, even in meat, which is one of the most oligopolistic or concentrated markets in the world, there are probably thousands of companies involved there, and there will be opportunity for thousands of companies eventually in cultivated meat. In terms of funding, there's certainly enough funding for this kind of like emerging small ecosystem to keep going for a while, but we're going to need to tap into much larger capital markets eventually in order to really replace meat on a global scale.
I had another question for you, Nate. Will we possibly see more vertical integration across players in the space, or more niches for specializations and service providers and across the value chain?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that kind of what we started with, something that we talked about was companies that were working on the entire vertically integrated system out of necessity, really, because there weren't those B2B companies available to specialize in things like cell culture media or scaffolding. So I would expect to see not as much vertical integration, although there will certainly be companies that succeed in vertically integrating, and that will be a strategy that companies pursue in the future, as they scale up and achieve increasing economies of scale.
And one more question for you. Do you think that the effects of COVID-19 will accelerate investment and as well as regulatory interest in the space?
Yeah, I think absolutely to both. We're certainly already seeing a increase in investment in 2020, early 2020, as I talked about. There's been a series of pretty large fundraisers there. It's clear that the current way that we produce meat is not going to be sufficient, and that causes huge problems for governments. And so I think we're going to see increasing interest from governments in the space. I know that I think recently the EU might have just allocated more funding to the space. I may be incorrect there, but yeah, certainly this is going to accelerate and makes very apparent the importance of meat cultivation in the future.
All right, a question for Elliot. What are current advances to produce cultivated fat cells, especially those with marbling effect or strings of fat and meat?
Sure. So obviously, fat is a really important component of meat, and many companies are focused in tandem with creating skeletal muscle tissue, as well as other tissue types like connective tissue. They're focused on creating fat. In some cases, some companies are focused on just creating fat that could serve as a sort of ingredient to other plant-based or hybrid alternative protein products. In terms of advancements, I'm not aware of particular ones that I could cite off the top of my head, aside from just knowing that several companies are working on this, and it's obviously a field of research that independent teams will be built out to study. But yeah, we certainly, I think, need a better understanding of how fat and muscle interact in co-culture and on scaffolds, and that will improve our understanding to create future cultivated meat products.
Another question for you, Elliot. Will cell lines immortalized in the laboratory through genetic engineering techniques be regulated as genetically modified food when used for cultured meat?
So the disclaimer here always when answering regulatory questions is these can change, the considerations can change across regions and countries, and of course nothing is set in stone yet for the industry. There's two ways to immortalize cell lines. One is through a spontaneous process where just through culturing cells over time can lead to the accumulation of genetic variants that allows them to bypass normal cellular checkpoints and allow them to become immortalized. And it's not expected that that sort of process would be regulated as a GMO because it's sort of a natural process that's similar that you could really relate to traditional breeding, let's say. Other ways to immortalize cells involve the introduction of different genes or overexpression or blockade of certain genes in the system that could involve genome modification. And so those will have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis in the kind of frameworks of different regions to really ultimately make that decision. But I'm I think somewhat hopeful that, especially with gene editing platforms, those things will be more permissible in the future.
A question for Nate. Is it possible to have an estimate for when cultivated meat products could hit the market?
Yeah, I mean, various companies have made their own predictions. So I don't want to speak for them, and things can change, but I've heard from some, 2021, 2022 for potentially sooner for a limited rollout of products. I mean, companies, I think we've had at least a dozen, if not more, different companies demonstrate their ability to create a cultivated meat product at small scale that people have eaten. And so, yeah, it's just probably a couple of years until we have those pilot scale facilities built up where you can maybe go buy it in a limited run somewhere. Hard to know after that, though.
A follow-up question for you. What do you feel is the single largest factor other than price that's restricting cultivated meat coming to market?
I mean, obviously the regulatory aspect is going to be huge. You know, it's like any kind of novel produced food, governments are going to want to make sure that it's safe. And obviously we want them to go through those processes, but that can sometimes take time. So we're optimistic that by the time the tech is ready, the regulators will also be ready, at least in some of the largest, most important jurisdictions for these products right now. So yeah, I'd say regulatory is the other big aspect.
Question for Elliot. Are animals harmed in establishing cell lines?
So there are many different stem cell types that can be used in the process, and they can be acquired through different means. So for instance, you can simply take a blood sample or a sample from a feather or a piece of hair to acquire fibroblasts that can be turned into a pluripotent stem cell that some companies are using. Otherwise, generally, tissues are obtained through something like a small biopsy that can be done under local anesthesia. That really, you can take tissue the size of, let's say, an eraser head back to the lab and digest that to derive the cell line of interest. So in general, you know, this process is quite humane. It's usually performed under the supervision of a veterinarian or otherwise medical sort of professional. And alternatively, you can also acquire cells from a recently slaughtered animal that the tissue is still viable and can be taken back to the lab. And so some companies in this sector partner with slaughterhouses for animals that are going to be slaughtered because for the traditional meat industry, and you can actually use that for the process as well. But in general, you know, it's fairly harmless.
And a follow-up question for you. What is the largest bioreactor volume that has currently been demonstrated for scaling up, for growing the cells for cultivated meat? What size reactors would be necessary to make cultivated meat products mainstream?
Complicated question. I guess, you know, we don't, you know, there's companies that would have the answer to that we're not privy to the exact volumes that they're working in. As Nate alluded to, many companies have stated that they're operating or plan to launch sort of pilot scale facilities this year and do pilot scale runs. And in general, this means, you know, maybe volumes in the 50 liter to up to 1,000 liter range. Although, you know, we're not certain of those exact numbers. To give you a sense of, you know, the maximum size of animal cell culture that's used in the biologics or other biopharmaceutical industry is around 20,000 liters that has ever been done. And so that's, you know, sort of an upper bound that, you know, I think companies would like to encroach upon over time. And there's some challenges, obviously, with scaling in different stirred tank reactor formats that cells get subjected to stresses, as well as nutrient sort of optimization for availability in those bioreactors. So scaling the industry is certainly one of the most pressing challenges for companies that are working their way to pilot scale right now, and we'll see how that progresses over time.
Great, thank you. Now a couple of questions for Elizabeth. The first is the Good Food Institute working with the FDA and USDA on general guidelines for the whole industry?
I don't think we can say we're working with them in the sense of proposing guidelines at this point, although we might consider doing that. You know, we certainly advocate to them on the issues. We were present at the FDA's public meeting on this and at the FDA-USDA joint public meeting and commented in those contexts on what they were proposing to do, and we certainly follow developments in that area.
Great, thank you. And then a follow-up question. What, if any, role do governments around the world need to play to encourage sustained growth in the industry?
So the number one thing that governments can do is fund research and development, open access research and development in these areas. And I'm sure that other panelists can speak to this too. So if any of them want to jump in, please do. But this area is in general underfunded for open access research. And you know, governments should be doing a lot more to fund that kind of research. I think it's, you know, also certainly true that creating effective and, you know, not too onerous, not unreasonably onerous pathways to a safety approval for these products is going to be important, and labeling regimes that are also not too onerous. You know, they need to assure customer safety, consumer safety via their safety approval processes, but, you know, safety approval processes shouldn't be too long and to be practical. But I think R&D should be really the #1 focus right now.
Thank you. A question for Nate. Do you think companies in the conventional meat sector would be more of an inhibiting or an enhancing factor for cultivated meat products?
Almost certainly enhancing. I mean, some of the largest meat companies in the world that we've talked about, Cargill, Tyson, PHW Group, and animal meat suppliers like Nutrico have been very supportive and involved in this sector because, you know, their interest is providing, you know, delicious, affordable protein to people, and that's what cultivated meat is going to allow them to do more effectively. So we really haven't seen them fighting it all that much. And there's a tremendous amount that they can bring to the table in terms of distribution, product formulations, regulatory and food safety approvals, all kinds of things that large companies are really, really great at, advertising. So yeah, we certainly expect the current industry to work with them, and think that they'll be a part of the future of meat. We don't think that they'll go away.
Great, thank you, Nate. And I believe we're coming up on time in terms of the time for the Q&A. So I think some folks could possibly hang on longer and answer questions directly into the chat. But otherwise, I'll hand it back to Nate for any close-up that he wants to do for this webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Really appreciate everyone coming out and learning about cultivated meat with us. We're incredibly excited about the future of the industry, and are excited to work with every one of you. Each individual person on this call has something unique that they can bring to the industry. So yeah, highly encourage you to get more involved and to go to GFI's website and explore. We've got a huge resource directory of various scientific papers, lists of companies in the sector, things like that. So yeah, highly recommend visiting our website, and you can always reach out to me if you need assistance with something. I can try to get you the relevant resource or connect you to the right person. Yep, thanks. Thank you all for joining us.